from the passage we just heard from the gospel reading. Now, among those who went up to worship at the festival were some Greeks. The Gospel of John is filled with all sorts of persons and groups. There are, of course, the Jews, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Samaritans, the outcast, the prostitutes and the tax collectors, the Roman soldiers, King Herod, Pontius Pilate, and of course the disciples. But not so the Greeks. This is, frankly, their one and only appearance in this gospel. One has to wonder, why were those Greeks in Palestine during the great time of the Jewish Passover? And essentially, why were they there to come and worship? Jerusalem during Passover, during the time of Jesus, was filled with Palestinian Jews and Jews who had made their pilgrimage from all over the known world at that time to come to the holy city. I think having some knowledge of ancient Greeks helps us to maybe place them in this location. As a people and culture, Greeks were always searching for truth. This group of Greeks probably had been traveling around the Mediterranean Sea area and heard about this particular Jew in Palestine who was teaching some new ideas and performing miracles. Naturally, they wanted to come and meet him and talk with him. Who wouldn't? I think they probably were very curious as to his insights and teachings about truth, and so they found Philip, a disciple of Jesus who just happened to have a Greek name, and they requested an opportunity to come and meet with Jesus. Now, backing up from this passage, we need to remember that Jesus had previously asked his disciples who the people said he was, and then he asked the disciples pointedly and directly that same question. But who do you say that I am? I wonder if someone were to ask you and I who Jesus is, what would we say as an introduction? How are people in our world today answering that question? I think there's probably very many answers depending upon what the person or groups have as their faith background or their orientation in life. I think it might be a good thing on this last Sunday in this season of Lent, right before we come next week and focus on Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem before the Passover on Palm Sunday, and then the beginning of Holy Week this next week, to give some serious thought as to who it is we say Jesus is. But I think before we do, it might be insightful to see how some of the major religions of this world would answer the Jesus question, but who do you say that I am? Most world religions, believe it or not, do acknowledge Jesus in one way or another. So we're going to do a little kind of world religions 101 here. Let's start with Muslims. Muslims revere Jesus as the son of Mary. In fact, Mary, the Virgin Mary, is the only woman mentioned in the Quran, the holy book of Islam. The Quran affirms that Jesus was born of the Virgin Mary. You heard that right. Muslims are actually defending the virgin birth of Jesus against some of our modern-day Christians who call that an impossibility. Muslims have also gone on the defensive against some Christian writers and thinkers who say that Jesus could not have possibly physically ascended into heaven after he died. Muslims believe that God, or Allah, took Jesus directly up into heaven. The Prophet Muhammad performed no miracles, but Jesus performed miracles according to the Quran. He healed the blind, he cured lepers, and directly quoting the Quran, Jesus brought forth the dead by Allah's power. It is in this way that Jesus is understood by Muslims to be the anointed one, or the Messiah. Now, frankly, not having read the Holy Book of Islam from cover to cover, In my research, I was frankly somewhat taken aback at these passages that focused on Jesus and who Muslims believe that he is. And I would imagine probably some of you are pretty surprised to hear some of these things I've just said. But having said them, here are the similarities of belief end. Stated earlier, I said that Muslims believe that Allah took Jesus directly up into heaven. But Muslims also believe that Jesus never physically died. See, Allah took Jesus directly up into heaven. That was done to save him from being crucified. Muslims believe that Jesus asked God to save him from dying on the cross, and the ascent into heaven was Allah's answering of that prayer. If Jesus had been killed, it would have meant that Allah had failed his prophet. And Muslims believe when Jesus returns, he's going to return as a Muslim, and his presence will prove that the crucifixion was a myth. Well, let's move on to Hinduism. Hinduism is the primary religion in India. Hindus find the concept of the one God too restrictive, and so they worship literally thousands of deities. And all of their gods, through strict religious discipline, offer a chance for human beings to realize a God consciousness. A popular myth that's perpetuated even by some Christians and written about by some modern-day Christian authors is that a teenage Jesus left his parents back in Palestine and came to India to find his God consciousness. This myth says that Jesus left without his parents' permission. He journeyed across Southeast Asia with some friends. He learned yoga and meditation and then returned home to Palestine to become a guru or an enlightened teacher for the Jews. Now, since none of the four Gospels mention what happened to Jesus from the time he was 12 years old until he was about 30 years old, we can see how this myth kind of fills in the blank. The most famous Hindu, Mahatma Gandhi, was attracted to Jesus' virtues of compassion and nonviolence. But my friends, this is as far as any Hindu will go in recognizing the person of Jesus. Jesus is nothing more to them than an enlightened guru, another guide or a teacher toward their individual goal of self-realization. All of us, according to Hindu belief, like Jesus, have the potential to discover our own inherent divinity. Hindus follow this belief to its natural conclusion. They wouldn't say that loving God and loving your neighbor are the greatest commandments. Hindus believe that you and me and we are all the same being. We are all inherently divine. We are all in essence one and the same being. And that's why Hindus like the statement that Jesus made, "The Father and I are one." Again, moving on, the stories of Jesus and the Buddha are amazingly similar. In some traditions of Buddhism, Buddha was conceived by a virgin, just like Jesus was. Both of them left home to go out into the wilderness, where each was tempted by an evil presence. Both returned with a clear vision of their ministry. Both worked miracles and challenged the religious establishments of their time by their teaching. Again, here the similarities end, though. You see, it is the goal of every Buddhist to become literally the Buddhist himself, the Buddha himself. Buddhists recognize Jesus only as just another human being, a partial and lesser copy of the true and divine Buddha. The Dalai Lama is probably the most preeminent and famous religious authority for Buddhists today. He is accorded great respect, even among prominent Christian religious leaders who invite him into their churches and they listen to his teachings. Interestingly, one of the teachings of the Dalai Lama is the revelation that Jesus did become a fully enlightened human and divine being. Well, finally, we come around to Judaism. Jesus, surprisingly, is not a person of great interest for modern-day Jewish lay people, but there's a great desire among Jewish scholars and rabbis to understand him more fully. There is no doubt that Jesus was a Jew. One of the elective courses that I took in seminary was titled Judaism as Jesus Lived It. The course was taught by the longest tenured faculty member of my seminary, who was a Reformed Jewish rabbi, who challenged us future Episcopal priests to understand the person of Jesus in his time and how he both affirmed and challenged the religious establishment. It was sobering and frankly quite embarrassing when Rabbi Falk asked us directly on the first day of class, "But who do you say that Jesus is?" How would you respond to a Jewish rabbi? Now, granted, I've taken a lot of time in this sermon to present views of Jesus from other world religions. As we see, there are some similarities and a lot of differences. But there is one large, overpowering difference between Christianity and other religions. Back then, the Greeks and the Romans didn't understand it. Back then, the disciples didn't see it and perceive it, at least at first. And every religion in the world except Christianity still doesn't understand it. And the "it" is the cross. The cross is what separates the Jesus of Christianity from every other Jesus persona or imitator in the world. This is the particularity of the Christian Jesus. You see, in Judaism, there's no precedent for the long-promised Messiah who comes and dies, especially in the manner of a criminal like Jesus did. For Islam, the story of Jesus' death on a cross is an affront to Allah himself. Hindus can only accept a Jesus who is able to go through a life passage into blissful nirvana. And so in our ecumenical relations with people of other religions and organizations, we need to be respectful of their beliefs and practices, but we should never, ever apologize, dilute down, or change our belief in Jesus as the Son of God, who was sent by God into this world as a sign and a sacrifice of God's love for all of us. Yes, my friends, Jesus died. And it was only by dying that God's Son could be raised from the dead to show the awesome power of God to defeat that ultimate enemy of humankind and restore all things into our Creator. I think that's why one particular hymn has become so popular in our churches. We sang it last week. I wish we could sing it this week. So if you were here, you know what I'm talking about. It was the last hymn we sung, but I bet every one of you, even at the 8 o'clock service, and they don't sing, they knew it as well. And part of the text of this hymn goes like this. Led on their way by this triumphant sign, the hosts of God in conquering ranks combine. Each newborn follower of the crucified bears on the brow the seal of him who died. O Lord, once lifted up on the glorious tree, your death has brought us life eternally. So shall our song of triumph ever be, praise to the crucified for victory. Lift high the cross, the love of Christ proclaim, till all the world adore his sacred name. My brothers and sisters, God bless you all. Amen.